Welcome to the final video in the course. This video is going to cover mastering. I think it'd be fun right now and informative if we checked out the journey of the track so far. So we'll check out arrangement to mixing, mixing to mastering. Starting with the arrangement, let's check out the arrangement and then the mix. Here we go. And then the mix to the master. Now, this is obviously going to be much more subtle, and your ears might not be primed to be picking up on the subtleties. So I'm going to play this a couple times here, and initially it might not seem like a huge difference, but as we go back and forth a couple times, the differences are going to become more and more dramatic. So starting with the mix, here we go. So to my ears, there's just an extra level of presence to the vocal in the master. When I switch back to the mix, the vocal just falls away just a little bit. And so that's what it's all about. It's just making these moves to push things a little bit further here in mastering. Another thing to pay attention to is listen to the punch of the kick in the master versus the mix. The punch is much more defined in the master. Also listen to the sustain just in general of the low end, just kind of the average level, just the control of the low end in the master versus the mix. There's more punch and there's more control. So all right, so I'm going to give you some information about mastering, and then we'll dive into the chain because the information is going to help kind of frame what's going on in the mastering chain right here. So the goals of mastering are pretty obvious. You want to make your track sound good, and you want to make your track sound loud. Now, the challenge of mastering is achieving both of these goals because they're often at odds with each other. How many times have you been mixing and it sounds pretty good, and then you even get into mastering and it sounds pretty good. Your track's sounding good, it's exciting, you like it, but then as soon as you try to make it loud, everything kind of falls apart and it starts to sound like crap all over again. Now, the reasons for this are pretty simple. Your track just can't handle your target level. Okay, that one's pretty obvious. It's kind of just describing the problem, right? And then the second reason is that every loudness strategy has side effects. So for example, if you're using compression, you run the risk of really just closing the dynamic range in a negative way. And people talk about closing the dynamic range or just having no dynamic range or killing the dynamics as a bad thing. And it's true. The reason why is because it's really the dynamic movement in your track that invites people to have a physical reaction to your track. So if your track just falls flat, then people just aren't going to respond to it in the same way. And when it comes to dance music, you really want to have that nice kind of pumping dynamic movement to get people moving on the dance floor. So that's one of the downsides potentially of using compression or overusing compression. Other kinds of things like distortion-based loudness techniques, like using a clipper or something like that, which is just extreme compression. That can introduce harmonics in your mix that make the mid-range and the top end especially sound unclear, kind of smeared and muddy. And it's kind of like this image. If you're looking out of the window and there's some raindrops on it, you can see what's behind it, but the raindrops distort what's behind it. They make it less clear. And in the same way, adding too many harmonics on the master may make your track appear louder, but it's also going to kind of smear the mid-range top end and take away the clarity in your master. And so my solution is actually kind of a workflow. It's switching things up, working backwards, kind of taking a top-down approach when it comes to making the track loud. First, I like to make the master loud, and then that means the track might not sound very good. But then I work to make the track sound less bad going into the loudness processor. And once the track sounds less bad and is able to handle the target level, then I work on making it sound more good. So the first thing, make it loud, then make it sound less bad, and then make it sound more good. So let's check these out one by one. So first, make it loud. And I like to use a limiter to hit the target loudness. And how do you determine what your target loudness is? Well, it's very simple. You can use a reference track and try to get in the ballpark of the reference track's loudness, or you could use some kind of loudness metric. So let me show you exactly what I do. So first things first, I just export my mix at -10. I just throw a utility plugin on the master, drop it down -10, and export the mix. And that just gives me plenty of headroom to work with here in mastering. Next, when we're in the mastering session like we are now, I just go get L2, which is just a limiter from Waves, just a very standard safe limiter. And I just bring down the threshold, which also makes up the gain by the exact same amount. And I just drive down the threshold until I hit certain loudness metrics. Let me show you what those are. My primary loudness metric that I go for is this guy, loudness units. And so here in Isotope's Insight, I try to hit between -6.5 loudness units and -7.5. So let's kind of see where we're sitting right now. So you can see I'm hovering kind of around -6.5 to around -7. Now another one that you can use is RMS. So this is a free one, Voxengo Span. And right here, it has an RMS readout. So here, this is less reliable for me. The range is a little bit bigger, but I'll try to get anywhere from around -7.5 to around -9. So let's see where we're sitting here. So kind of around -8.5 to -9. And finally, the BX meter here is going to give me a readout of the dynamic range, which is another thing that you can look at. And I try to hit probably around 3.5 to 5. 3.5 means that you have a pretty small dynamic range. It's pretty squashed. And so let's see where we're sitting here. So basically just hovering around 5 there. So this is kind of cool. Usually I'll have to clamp down on the dynamic range in order to achieve a certain loudness unit. So this is kind of getting the best of both worlds, where I'm getting a nice perceived loudness value here in the with the LUs, but I'm also getting a slightly open dynamic range, which is cool. Now, when I mean open dynamic range, Brainworks recommends not going below 6 in the dynamic range, and I'm at 5. And sometimes I'll get up to like 3.5, and lots of other tracks will get around those ranges as well. So not a lot of dynamic range, but more than I usually get, but I'm still able to get a nice kind of loudness units here. And just as a point of reference, I want to show you who to fuck through these processors and also synthetic, just to show you that these are really the ranges that I go after. So with who to fuck, let's check this out in Isotope's Insight. So just around 7.3, around 7.0 to 7.3. So again, I'm trying to get -6.5 to -7.5 here, and it looks like I'm hitting that. With the RMS, again, -7.5 to 9. Let's see where we are. All right, just hovering right above -8 here. And then with the dynamic range, let's see where we are. All right, this one's hovering right around 4. All right, so a little bit more squash than the Jello track or the PAWSA reference. And then with synthetic, this one is pretty loud. I was able to get quite a lot of level out of this one. Let's see where we are here. All right, kind of planted right around here, around -6.5. And then with the RMS, cool. So this one's sitting around -7.7 about, and then over here in the dynamic range. So this is kind of going between 3.5 and 4, so really squashed here. And just to simplify, all we're doing is we're cranking the limiter to get within the ballpark of the loudness target. Now this sounds pretty good because we're actually listening to the mastering chain, but the first time you do this, it might not sound that great. And so that brings us to the next step, which is making it sound less bad. So first make it loud, then make it less bad, all right? And the key questions here, ask yourself what's causing the ugliness? Okay, what's causing the loudness processor to maybe overwork or to have really negative side effects? What's causing the ugliness? And another key question, can you fix it in the mix? And so in a way, you're like a mastering engineer talking to yourself as a mixing engineer saying, hey man, guess what? If we make these changes in the mix, the track would be able to better handle the loudness target that we're after. So to show you what that would look like, let's switch over to the L2 chain here in the master level. I'm actually using Isotope's Maximizer for the loudness processor, but we'll get there in a little bit. So switching over to L2, let's just crank the threshold a little bit more. That doesn't sound terrible at this level because I've made the changes. But if I was going to make changes at this level, what do you hear as being problematic? So if I was going to go back and make some more changes in the mix, I would probably take about 300 to about 500 hertz out of the bass, just about like a dB or so. I'd kind of try to find that frequency and just kind of tap it down about a dB. And that's it. Most of the changes that you need to make back in the mix are going to be very small tonal changes, very small level changes. Another thing I would do is maybe increase the distance between the kick and when the bass rises from the sidechain. So I could do that either with the LFO tool, pulling back on one of the nodes, just creating a little bit more space between the kick and the bass, or I could also increase the release time on the sidechain compressor. Both of those would probably work, and I'm talking just very subtly, just trying to separate the kick and the bass just a little bit more. And finally, I think that I could bring down some harshness in the vocal mid-range, about 2 to 5K. But I'm not trying to go after this crazy loudness. To me, it sounds pretty good when we're at the negative, I think it was negative 9.7. This sounds pretty good to me. But if there was little things sticking out like that when I was trying to achieve this volume, I'd go back in the mix and I'd make those changes. And so just to show you what that looks like, this is the root folder for the project. And as you can see, I have these things called master prep. And that's exactly what these are. Master prep is when I go back into the mix, make a small level or tonal change, re-export it back into mastering. And this looks like a lot more work than it is. As you can see, here's a master prep and then a master, and then a second master prep, going back into the master, a third master prep, and then a fourth master prep. So there's only 4 times I went back. And typically this is going to happen when I'm listening on different kinds of speakers. So maybe I'm working on my headphones one day and I make some changes in the mix. It sounds good. I put it back into the master. It sounds good. Then I go check on my car and I'm like, you know what? I could actually probably fix this. So I go back in the mix, make some small adjustments there. This is me just testing the mix and the master and the loudness out on different systems, seeing what those different systems are telling me about how I can kind of further optimize the track for loudness. And then once the track is able to handle the level that you want, your target level, then you figure out how you can make it sound more good, right? How can you make it sound better going into the loudness processor? And this completely depends on the track. You have to ask yourself what's important, what's exciting, and how can you use the tools in mastering to bring out those exciting elements and shine a spotlight on what's important. In our track, the most important elements are the bass and the vocal. And so most of the master processing is going to be dedicated to bringing those out, which is exactly what we listened for at the beginning of the video. So at this point, we can dive in and check out the mastering chain. Let's turn all the processing off except for the master level here at the end. And what we'll do first is look at the mastering container. The first thing I like to do is put the master in this gentle dynamic container. I take another L2 here, and I gently touch down on the peaks of the track. So this is really only clipping down on the inconsistent peaks, about a dB to a dB and a half. And the reason why is that there's a mastering compressor after this. And I want to feed this mastering compressor a very consistent peak level. So this mastering compressor can behave very predictably and give the dynamic glue and the dynamic movement and the pump to the mix in exactly the way that I need it to. So that's all this guy is doing. It's totally inaudible. What's more audible is lifting the track up from the low level. So I'm doing some upwards compression as well, very gentle. And this to me just feels like it lifts the track up from the bottom. It gives a really nice presence push to the top end ambience. And then also it gives a really, really nice gentle push to the bottom end as well. Together, these guys just create this little dynamic container. This guy's pushing down from the top, this guy's pushing up from the bottom. So we're kind of just already kind of controlling the dynamic range. So before and after here, and you're not going to really hear the downwards compression, but you'll definitely hear the upwards. It's going to be subtle. Hopefully you can hear it, but let's check this out. So after this little container guy, I want to make adjustments to the mix, to the tone of the mix if I need to. And so I'm going to open up Pro Q here, and I also use Ozone's EQ. So let's open these guys. Now with Pro Q, I've said this probably 8 million times in this video, but I just like to use it a lot for just finding frequency spikes. So for example, at this level, at the bus level, you'll have different like classes of instruments or different instruments or subgroups add together and create these little frequency spikes that maybe aren't present on the individual channels of the mix or even on the subgroups of the mix. And when I find them, I typically treat them dynamically. So right here, these are just tapping down on those frequency spikes that occur in the mid-range. Now, I don't want to treat them in a static way. In a static way, it would just be like me bringing this guy down, because this frequency range is so important and so full of excitement that I'd be permanently killing the mix. I just want to tap down on those frequency spikes when they occur. That way, this range is able to stay present, but not ever become overly harsh. And so let me show you what some of these sound like. I hope I don't ruin our ears here, but let's check this out. All right, so just those really harsh things that when amplified or when you really push into a limiter or something, those can pop out. And so I'm just treating those, just tapping down on those when they occur. Looks like I also did a little bit here to the kind of honky part maybe of the vocal, of the bass, and then a little bit of low mids here as well, just tapping down on some things. Over here in Pro Q, I'm also removing the low end information on the side. So as you can see here, I'm rolling up to 150 hertz on the side. And so that's ensuring that I have a perfectly mono signal in the low end. And perfectly mono meaning it's literally only what the left and the right share. Sometimes you'll have imagers where instead of removing the side information, it actually just collapses the side information down to mono. And that ends up creating exactly the type of phase issues that you want to avoid, because it's the difference between the left and the right that's going to cause phase issues in mono. So the last thing you want to do is collapse them down to mono, or collapse them down to the center channel, I guess more technically. And then here, with the removing the side information from the low end, I'm literally removing any difference between the left and the right speaker on the low end, rather than simply summing it or collapsing it down to the center channel. Okay, so I hope that's clear, but this is my preferred way of ensuring that the low end is in fact mono. So these two EQs are primarily doing corrective work. All right, this guy is just taming potential harshness from different mix elements adding up together, and I can take care of that at the bus level here in mastering. And then this guy is just protecting us from getting any kind of low end that might be phasey or anything like that. And then there's another EQ here in Ozone, this guy, and he is just doing some very gentle tonal shaping. If you look at the scale of the EQ, it's just going 0.5, 1 dB, 1.5, 2 dB. So these are very subtle changes in the tone of the mix, pushing the low end forward, and I'm pushing the vocal forward, and I'm also dipping out a little bit of the low mids. And the reason why is because I want to create a little bit more separation between the low end, the bass and the kick, and then the vocal. And so it kind of heightens the mix in that way by separating them even further. And so let's listen to these changes. Pretty much the only thing that's going to be really noticeable is the softening of the mid-range here. So let's really listen for that. Listen to the vocal, and then when I turn this processing on, you'll feel the mid-range just soften a little bit. It becomes less harsh and a little bit more controlled in these frequency ranges. So let's check this out. Here's before. All right, next up is the multi-band compressor from Isotope, Ozone. See what's going on here. We have some compression in most of the bands. Now, just because there's a band here doesn't mean you need to give compression or anything like that. But there was certain goals that I had for each of these bands. Now, for the low band, what I wanted to do was give a ceiling to the kick punch, to the kick low end. So that's what this limiter is doing right here, just giving a ceiling to the low end punch. And then what I also wanted to do was compress the sustain of the bass and give a little bit more, again, punch to the kick. So what that means is that for this compressor right here, I want it to clamp down on the bass sustain, but I don't want it to clamp down on the kick punch. So I'm using a slightly slower attack here to let that kick transient through, but we're taming the kick transient, or at least the low end transient from the kick, with the limiter here, and then we're clamping down on the sustain of the bass after the kick transient's able to cut through the low end compressor here. And then a slightly slower release. It's not too slow. It's actually kind of a fast release, but we're just clamping down on the sustain and just really giving a lot more punch to the low end transient of the kick. And so let's see if we can solo this and hear that. So listen to the difference between the kick and the bass. So if I have this off, then they're a little bit glued together and they don't feel as controlled. Listen to this. Then with it on, you'll feel the kick transient. And then next is, let's move to the mid-band here. The mid-band, you'll see, is more active dynamically. Let's check this out. And I didn't want to do much here. I just wanted to give a little bit of ceiling to the peaks of the mid-range and just do some very gentle compression. You'll see it's a relatively slow attack, 50 milliseconds. And we've already kind of softened the mid-range with the dynamic EQ. So I just kind of wanted to contain the mid-range just a little bit more where the vocal is and bring it out. Again, the primary focus of this track is the bass and the vocal. So here I'm really solidifying that low end, giving a nice punch to the kick. Then here just giving a little bit more presence to the vocal. And the top end here, let's check this out. So you'll see that the top end compressor here is engaged when the vocal and the open hat is playing together. This goes back to what we were mentioning earlier. When you have different subgroups or different instruments in the mix add together, and here in the top end, the vocals adding together with the open hat, and I'm just touching down when we get a little level spike there in the top end when they play together. And finally, with the low mids, let's check these out. very gentle, but this just goes back to what I was saying earlier of trying to get a little bit more separation between the low frequency band and the mid frequency band, or where the low end kick and bass sit and where the vocals sit. So I'm just tapping down on this frequency range, and I'm not doing any makeup gain. So just giving just the slightest amount more separation to the bass and the vocal. Now, I think the biggest difference here is in the low end. So when we A-B this, listen really to the low end punch. Also, we're going to get some nice presence out of the vocals. So again, just listen to the kick and bass. Here we go. So the Ozone Dynamics module helps us increase the presence of the instruments in different frequency bands by letting us gently kind of compress them and then move them forward in the mix with the makeup gain. But if we want to be a little bit more edgy, a little bit more aggressive, we can actually distort frequency ranges. So the next plugin here is the Ozone Exciter. And basically, you just select the frequency band, maybe that you want to distort or saturate and increase the presence or excitement of, and you have these two knobs here. You can increase the amount of the distortion, and then you can mix that amount in, and you have these different distortion types. And so as you see, I have decided not to saturate the lows and the low mids. I'm only pushing the mids and the top end. And here, let's listen to what that sounds like. And if I increase the mix all the way, still really subtle, but if I start increasing the amount here, you can hear that it starts to distort. Now, earlier in the video, I cautioned you about adding too many harmonics in your mix, especially in the mid and the top band, because it will kind of smear the clarity, kind of blur things. And that's why I'm being really subtle about this. So I think I had the amount around 4. So let's listen to that with the mix 100%. Turn that off. You can see you just lose a little bit of presence. And in the context of all the frequency bands, what does that sound like at 100%? Without. So you can really add some presence here. But again, I want to just mix this in at a subtle amount, so it looks, I think I had about 3. And the exact same thing over here with the top end. I just wanted to add a little bit of sparkle on top. Now, I didn't think that I had enough top end to really do anything up here, so I came over to the beginning of the mastering chain and added this Moog EQ. And I'm just lifting the air band here at 40K. Now, you might be like, well, that's not doing anything. It's 40K. But remember, you're also sloping up into 40K. So you're actually lifting frequencies that might be closer around to 20 or 10K, just very gently. And I'm just kind of slightly pushing this so that the exciter here has something a little bit more to latch onto. And then after the Moog EQ with the Pro Q, I'm actually doing a 30K roll off here, because I really just want this to boost the audible top end in a very gentle way. And I don't need anything above the audible top end, so I'm just rolling that away at 30K with Pro Q. So let's listen to the before and after here. It should be pretty subtle. Next up, we have iZotope's Imager here. And this is a very, very simple plugin, kind of like the Exciter. You just choose the frequency band, and then you just have one slider here determining the width of that band in the Imager. And over here in the Exciter, we have 2 bands, so twice as complicated. Not really. But then here in the Imager, just I'm pushing the low mids and the mid-range. Okay, that's it. You just lift this up based on the range that you want to push. Now, down here, this is what I was talking about earlier. I don't want to collapse everything down to the center channel. I've already rolled off everything that I want to roll off in the low end on the sides, so I don't need to worry about the low end being mono. It's already done back earlier in the chain. And so here, let's check this out. Now, there's not a lot of stereo content in this production, as you can hear, but there's enough for me to just slightly push things a little bit so it feels more open in a stereo image. So if I close this down, see how it just feels like it opens up? And again, everything in moderation. I think I had this around 19 or so. When I turn it off, you could just feel the stereo presence just kind of fall a little bit to the middle. And the same thing with the mid-range. Let's listen to this. It's like open, close, when on, off, open, close. See if you could feel that. Next up, we have the mastering compressor. Now, this is to add a little bit more dynamic movement into the track and to also kind of glue things together a little bit more. And again, just squeeze a little bit more level out of the track to bring it forward. Now, what I like to do is I like to get a couple different compressors and find the settings that I like for each compressor. And then I will decide which one I like the best. So in this case, I ended up liking Ableton's glue compressor. And if you see, I'm actually using the exact same settings as we used on the lows bus, where I'm clamping down on the kick transient just a little bit, and then I'm getting a smooth kind of pump with the release time here. So let's see if this is making a huge difference or not. Cool, pretty subtle, but that's it. So let's check out the combined effect of the master processing. And if you remember, we're trying to make it sound good going into the loudness processor, trying to make it sound better. And we are focusing on the important aspects of the mix, which is the bass and the vocal. And so when I listen to this, I feel that the low end gets tighter and more assertive and more controlled. And for me, the vocal just increases in presence and excitement. And that's pretty much the two things that we are trying to do along the chain here. All right, so before and after. Let's check it out. So that's probably a little bit more apparent than when we first checked out the mastering chain, because our ears are probably a little bit more tuned to pick up on the subtle changes here. So last thing here with the master level, this is bringing it up to 0 dB, also clamping down and getting that level. Now, we know it's going to sound pretty good because of everything that we've done before. We made it sound less bad going into the loudness processing by fixing some things in the mix. Also, these moves down here helped us optimize a little bit more compression, a little bit more presence for the important things in the mix. And so that helps us really bring those out in the master. And so just like the compressor, what I like to do is audition different kinds of loudness processors. Now, most of the time I'm going to be using L2. It's just a very safe way to go. It's just a good loudness maximizer, ultra maximizer, as it says. But I like to give other things a try as well. And so another thing that I like to try is the maximizer from Isotope, Ozone's maximizer. And this is really cool because it gives you all these different algorithms, so you could really find something that when you really crush the mix, it starts to sound okay. It sounds pretty good. And so I landed on IRC 4 with the transient mode here. And this is just me going through these different modes and seeing which one I like the best. And it's basically which one gives me the least amount of side effects as I try to push the level. Remember we were talking about side effects before? I'm trying to find something that gives me the least amount of side effects. So let me turn this down because we'll drive this a little bit here. Maybe we'll turn it down a little bit more, down to -12 or something like that. So check this out. So if I jump up to IRC1 here and we drive the threshold, hear that distortion, and then here, let's try IRC2. And so they both sound bad, but I think that the second one, the IRC2, is the least of the two evils. And so what if we choose the one that we ended up going with? See? Way less side effects, even when we're just crushing it right here. So that's what I mean by making sure that you're minimizing the side effects. You can just look for a loudness processor that gives you the least amount of side effects. And so that's why I like auditioning different processors here. A couple other contingencies here. We have these two C1 Comp SCs, and this was me being a little bit lazy, but this was the last thing I did in the master. And what I did is I just automated down these guys right here. So this is, I think, 3K, and this is 5K. And during the breaks, when we had this vocal, that was a little bit harsh, especially if you're going to play this at really loud volumes in a club. The 3 and 5K were a little bit harsh, so I just took these compressors right here, these frequency-specific compressors, and I just pulled them down a little bit. You can see we're just tapping down on those frequencies, preventing them from getting too harsh. And that's the only thing that's going on here, and then also going on here. And I'm just automating down the thresholds. That covers the master processing. And again, I recommend starting with loudness. Go after the loudness that you want, either using a reference track or using the technical metrics like we looked at earlier. And then try to start optimizing your track to make it work at that loudness level. Make sure that your track can handle the target loudness that you want. And then once it's able to handle it, if you want to, you can continue down the path and then keep on just tweaking a little bit, as I like to do, in very subtle amounts, just bringing out the important things in the track. And so in our track here, we're bringing out the bass, made it sound more assertive, more controlled, and then also bringing out the vocal, giving it a little bit more excitement, a little bit more presence. So we reach the end of the course, and I just want to say thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the course as much as I enjoyed making it, and I hope you got as much out of the course as I got out of making it. And feel free to shoot me an email and share your tales of victory. So if you've never made a track before and this course played a part in helping you finish your first track, then send me that, because I definitely want to hear it. It's very cool. And definitely one of the most important steps for your path as a producer is getting over that hill and finishing one of your first tracks. And then next, if you've never really made a track that you've been proud of and you've taken some techniques from this course and you finally made something that you're willing to share with your friends and post online and show your family, then definitely send that my way as well, because I want to check that out. That's really cool as well. And if you've never had a track signed before, and again, this course has helped you in some small way get to that milestone, then send me that track as well, because that is super cool, right? That's definitely the step in furthering your career as a producer. So thank you so much again for checking out the course. If you made it all the way to the end, that's awesome. There was so much information in here. I really hope you learned a lot from production, mixing, mastering, just getting a more efficient workflow. Try to pack it all in here, and hopefully you got something from it. But on to the next project for me, on to the next project for you, and I wish you the best of luck. Cheers.